what is the best fantasy sci-fi book out there, objectively, but also especially for us as Christians to read? Well, to answer that, we're going to look at two questions, which is, should Christians be reading fantasy novels at all? And second, what kinds of novels should they be looking at? And I promise you, unlike most of my videos where we're searching for a best, I will give a specific best that I think. I'm your host, Daniel Kelly, and today what we're looking at is novels, and specifically a subset of novels. Fiction novels would be fantasy and science fiction novels. They're usually kind of grouped together like that. And first, why should we be looking at this? Well, a very good way to think about this that I heard recently was from Matt Fradd of Pints with Aquinas. He said that the unused artillery of the Christians is novels, right? We haven't used it, but it's such a powerful way to spread the Christian message. And I agree with him, and actually I'd go further using that image of artillery and warfare and stuff. This is where novels, especially fantasy and science fiction novels, are where Christians lost the sexual revolution. Sexual revolution brought all these things that are very bad for humanity and for persons, and Christians were not prepared for it, and they lost. One reason I think is because we did, as the church said we're not to do, we despised these different mediums, and we just left them to whoever was going to use them. And the people who did use them were people who were interested in promoting a very different morality, and that's why the sexual revolution, I think, and a different video I'll explain why I think that, but this is where, so first, fantasy novels kind of got their start in Christianity, or they wouldn't have gone anywhere. We've got people like Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and these really great, amazing Christian and Catholic thinkers, but then we kind of we dropped the ball, and that's where we're getting all this kind of now polyamory is accepted, all these ideas of transhumanism, all that stuff is first in fantasy novels. That's where it became accepted. It's because from the whole fantasy novels is because they promoted these things and they made it palatable to people. And just let me tell you, there's way worse stuff in store if it keeps going this way. If you just look at, because I've read them all, because I wasn't raised Christian, Catholic. I read all kinds of stuff, and things are going to get worse. There's even creepier stuff than what's happening right now. So we can't abandon this sphere to the non-religious. And I think it's interesting. One example I'm going to use is that we really did abandon it. And it's not because people were looking for this kind of weird, creepy stuff that, and the fantasy novels are just that, and people were looking for it. No, I think we left the space to this creepy stuff. For example, one very popular fantasy novelist who's not Christian, not Catholic, writing in this period that we're kind of looking at was David Eddings. He wrote the Belgariad, and I'll talk a little bit about that, but he's like, I'm really good with English, how can I make money? And he looked, oh, what's selling is fantasy novels. And he looked, and he was all like, in no moral framework really at all. And he was like, oh, well, what sells better? What do people want more? And because he wants to make money. That's what he wanted to do. And that's not a bad thing. You want to make a living. And he looked, and he said, things with like these weird sexual things and different actually sell less well. So I'm not going to put that in my book because I want to make money, and books that don't have that sell better. So people weren't looking for this weird stuff. It's just they were looking for something they could find in these fantasy science fiction novels, and the only ones had this weird stuff, and that's how this kind of things became mainstream and acceptable. So if you're I'm not going to go over, because this novel, this video, what I'm looking at is just novels that I think are really good. I'm not looking at bad ones. We're going to review probably like a dozen different novels, and look at some of their good and bad points, just really quick reviews, and see, because all these ones I'm showing you are ones that I think are important for Christians to understand in some way or another. So having said that, what's one of the first books we can kind of look at that has really influenced our culture, modern culture? Well, if you're my age and grew up, you'll recognize it right away. So let's look at this, Harry Potter. This is the first one, and there's all kinds of different editions, but this is definitely the first one I read. I didn't write it, J.K. Rowling wrote it, but I read it, and it had an influence on me and a lot of people of my generation, and I think we should examine it just real quickly. So one of the first things we have to say is there's this big, in Christian and Catholic circles, there's this big pushback against Harry Potter, because we shouldn't be reading that because it's got magic and wizards, and those are bad. And it is true, very clearly condemned in the Bible, using magic and divination and all that stuff. So that's true. In the real world, we can't use magic. But I'm going to be pulling some ideas of how to look at magic in fictional worlds from a really good essay. I'll link to it in the description, about magic in fictional worlds he's a deacon Stephen Greidranis. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. But he wrote a really good essay on, well, is it okay to read or watch movies, because he's a film critic. And I'll link to his website, Decent Films. Is it okay to this entertainment that has magic in it? Well, some people would just say, yes, it is, because look, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis use it, and there's very few Christians that you could say that would say, no, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis are bad, right? So they have magic, therefore it's fine to have magic. Well, that's not quite true, because either we can't just say that, because you can have magic portrayed in a lot of different ways. In Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, it's very clearly portrayed as not something for human beings to be doing, right? Humans don't use magic in either of those, and it being good. So that's one, separating it from Harry Potter. But I think in a fictional world, we can imagine a world where God made hate the thing you're supposed to do, but we can imagine a world where there's something called magic that's not wrong to do. So when we're reading these fictional worlds, that's okay. It's okay to see that. But what we want to look at in seeing if the magic portrayed in a book is bad or not is, there's a bunch of things, and read the essay, but there's a couple. First, is it going to give scandals? Is it going to tempt me to try to look into these occult things and do magic? And for that, Harry Potter, no, I wouldn't say that, because it doesn't have there are real occult practices, and Harry Potter doesn't really have them. Well, if it hasn't at all, it's the bad guys doing them. It's not portrayed as a good thing. So that's the thing. Another thing we can be tempted to is if we just think that, oh, magic and that stuff's not real, it's just harmless fun to have in movies. You can watch it in stuff like all kinds of shows and stuff now have a diabolical occult aspect, and that's fine because it's harmless fun, because it's not real. That's kind of the author of Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling. That's kind of her view on it. But we can't. No. We know that these things are real. So we want to see how much a book tempts someone to use actual magic. And Harry Potter, I would say, no, it doesn't. It is more than Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, because they very intentionally want to show that magic is not for human beings, and Harry Potter doesn't do that. Okay, so now that we have a framework for, is magic okay for a Christian to read about in books? Well, it shouldn't desensitize us, and it shouldn't scandalize us and tempt us to get into doing real world occult stuff. Let's look at some of the good points of Harry Potter and the Harry Potter series, and some of the bad points. Well, some of the good points is the author says the whole theme of it is love, and there are good points of showing love, but I actually think if we're picking a virtue that it shows better is faith, because you're supposed to trust in the people you already know are good people, and it's shown over and over, and it keeps going. Each book one-ups, okay, even though it looks like this person, authority figure you're supposed to trust, he's and you know that you can, that he's a trustworthy person. Oh, it looks like he's doing something evil. Oh, even more evil. Are you still going to trust him? And every time they should have. So I think it shows the virtue of faith very well. It shows young adults in a very healthy way not being over-sexualized. I love that about the Harry Potter series. It shows having a good group of friends and developing as a young adult in very good ways. All those are really good about the Harry Potter series. One of its bad points is that they're just liars. Lying is portrayed as not a big deal. There's so much lying in it, and I think that's very bad. So that's one book that I do think is a good book if young adults want to read it, better than most of these other things like Twilight and stuff out there, because it shows very healthy, normal young adult relationships that don't have a bunch of sex or anything weird like that. But I'm definitely not going to say this is the best fantasy novel. So we're going to move on. Well, we already mentioned looking at fantasy novels, you can't, and as a Christian, you have to bring up two people, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. They're kind of like the Christian authors. So we're gonna, let's look at them. So Tolkien writes a really good essay on how Christians should look at fantasy, and it's super good. I'm not going to recap it all here. Maybe we'll do a video on it, and I'm definitely going to link it into the description. And Tolkien talks about how fairy tales and making up these stories shows our image, how we're an image of God, and it's amazing because God creates, but we're sub-creators when we write and stuff. So it's really cool, and it also there is a kind of way where we spread the gospel through these stories, or it prepares us for the gospel. Okay, so in Tolkien's books, and I'm just going to be looking at it, he wrote a lot, but let's look at some of his really more important ones. So the first one, of course, is The Hobbit. Everybody's probably read The Hobbit. You read it to your kids. It's a really good book. Well, this version of The Hobbit I don't think you're reading to your kids, but I really like it a lot because it just, C.S. Lewis once said he wouldn't know what glory is, what it meant when we said that God's full of glory if he hadn't been in the wilderness and seen raw wilderness. That's where the content for the word glory comes from for him. And that's true. I like that a lot. But I think that's true for me for reading Tolkien's books. Especially The Hobbit is really good for kids. It just gets that imaginative, it gives us the imaginative firepower to be able to put content to these attributes and our way of relating and knowing what God is like, because we can know intellectually, but it could just be a dry knowledge without meat on its bones. It really, one thing I really like about Tolkien's books is there's a lot of, especially The Hobbit, but all of them, there's this sense, it gives you this sense of adventure. I wouldn't know what an adventure the gospel and the Christian life is. I wouldn't know it as well if I hadn't read Tolkien's books. Another big theme in the idea of, and this comes through less in like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and more in his other books, where he says the history is just the story of the long defeat, right? We lost to Satan, and that's what history is just defeat after defeat until God, right, Jesus comes on the scene and reverses it. But even after that, history is still the story of the great defeat in many ways. And he shows that really well in a lot of his works. Especially, this is one of his sideways ones, The Children of Hurin. It's really, really good, but it is definitely the saddest book I've ever read, and it really gives content to the problem of evil. God has to solve this problem. It shows just the evil and not the solving of it. It shows evil so well and so just completely destroying someone, evil, someone who's trying to be good, and just evil, the devil being as evil as he can be. It's a really tough book that way. But another big theme of Tolkien's work that I think is really good for us Christians, and I think every Christian, if possible, should read at least The Hobbit, but is this idea, he called it eucatastrophe. That's the theme of Christian fiction, is everything seems really dark and really bad, but there's a eucatastrophe, which is the happy turn, how everything, and it has to still be in line with the logic of the story where everything seems hopeless, but then there's that happy turn. And he says that prepares us for the resurrection. That is the resurrection, the seeds of the resurrection in all these stories, because the resurrection is the ultimate eucatastrophe. Okay, and I think the Lord of the Rings, and it's beat up. Here's my copy of the Lord of the Rings. I'm going to show that to you. It doesn't have a dust cover or anything. I've read it many times. My wife was asking me recently, how many times have you read that? And I was like, I don't know. And she's like, well, more than 10? I was like, definitely more than 10. But so anyway, that tells you how much I like the Lord of the Rings. But I think one of the really good parts of it is the happy turnaround when everything seems lost and boom, the good guys do win in the end. So Tolkien is definitely really high up there on books that I think, especially The Hobbit, and then The Lord of the Rings, and then all his other stuff, that Christians should read. It's really helpful just to grow in our spiritual life. So there's much more that could be said about Tolkien and has been said, and maybe we'll do more episodes on him. But let's move to C.S. Lewis, the other great Christian writer. He's not Catholic. Tolkien was Catholic. C.S. Lewis was not Catholic. But C.S. Lewis is where many people encounter the Christian message first. And it's in this collection of books. I'm going to show you mine again. Excuse that it's beat up, but Narnia, right? Almost everybody, in a way, it made the Christian message more mainstream than it would be, because that's what Narnia is the story of it's Christianity cloaked in kind of a fantasy story, right? And some really good things about it is it gives content to one of Jesus's titles that we forget about a lot, is that he's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And kind of Narnia is a big extended parable on a way to understand the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And that there's this, we're always trying to kind of domesticate Jesus's message and tame it and fit it to our worldview. And there's just this really great term in the Narnia series that is just so good, where God, Aslan in the world, is the name they have for how he became incarnate in that world. He's not a tame lion. We can't domesticate the gospel. We can't domesticate God's message. And I think that's really, really important. That's something that has stayed with me. A lot of lines from Narnia have formed my worldview very much, and I think they're especially good for children. One of the objections lobbed kind of at the Narnia books a lot is, yeah, it's good when you're a kid, but then when you reread it, it's not as good. It gets less good with time, and that's a mark of a bad novel. And I'd agree that that's a mark of a bad novel, but it definitely hasn't happened to me. I've actually enjoyed Narnia more as an adult than I did as a child. I actually didn't really like Narnia very much as a child. One of the objections with it is that also that Narnia is too preachy. It's too obviously Christian, but I can see where that's coming from, but I also think that there's a lot of non-Christians who have enjoyed Narnia, and it has brought them closer to understanding the Christian message. So one of the things I really like about Narnia is just the adventure books. I love books that are stories of discovery. So The Horse and His Boy in Narnia, and Voyage of the Dawn Treader in Narnia, where you're just discovering, you're going on an adventure. It's kind of like the old Greek epic, right, the Odyssey, right, where you're just discovering all this stuff. And there's a main overarching storyline, but you get to just discover all this cool stuff in the world. I really like that. One of the things I really like in Narnia is the last book. I'm not going to spoil it, but is just so, it really shows us how to understand that God's still fulfilling his promises even if evil wins. Okay? And in this just cataclysmic way, how it seems like evil's winning, just utterly. Because in reality, look, evil has won in these situations, and that happens in our lives a lot. But how to show, well, yeah, okay, that thing did happen that's super evil, and God doesn't just magically undo that, but God still wins and fulfills his promises. So I think that book is underrated, and we could do a whole episode on that. Another really important part of C.S. Lewis's corpus of written works is this. This is a collection in one book, but his space trilogy. It's science fiction, and it's really good. Any of the books in it are really good. They're all real different styles. And it's kind of like seeing what would the Christian, playing with, okay, God's given us all this cool revelation in the Christian message. What does that mean for finding like new life other places? Or what does it mean if different things happened here on earth? And just really, it's just rejoicing in God's creation by using our minds. It has a lot of, it gives flesh or meaning, content to a lot of Christian imagery that we just use. It explains angels really well when sometimes we can just make them too abstract or too much like people, but he gives us a really good vision on angels. And another really good thing is it's the only book I've really found where evil people that are, I would say, believable as people, he does really well. If you've ever read his Screwtape Letters, you know he can write evil really well. Well, he writes really, really evil people very well, but realistically, so that you're not like, that's not a real person, I would say. So I think those are really good things about the Space Trilogy, and I think it helps any Christian grow in the knowledge of their faith to look at it from these different angles that C.S. Lewis does. So Tolkien and C.S. Lewis's novels are definitely up there for, we're looking for the greatest. These could definitely contenders for the greatest. The next one we're going to look at is, so C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, a lot of people don't know, but were inspired very much, and you can see it if you know, and if you want to research all this, and if you want to read more, by the corpus of Welsh mythology called the Mabinogion. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but if you want to dig more deeply into that, you can tell they're inspired. And other novels, a lot of fantasy is inspired by this collection of Welsh mythology, but we're not really familiar with it. Like we're familiar with Grimm's fairy tales, those kind of things, but most of us aren't familiar unless you're studying that stuff. These stories come to us by way of Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and these different people. But if you want an introduction, like a novel that helps us see where they're coming from, that's not the actual Mabinogion, yeah, go read those stories, find translations and stuff of those. They're good. They're fun. But a really good book that I like that's also a good for young adults or children fantasy novel is Lloyd Alexander's The Book of Three. And if you read this, I think that you'll, again, my copy's kind of messed up, I apologize for that, but I think it's a really good, it helps you appreciate Tolkien and C.S. Lewis more to read these. And I also think that Prydain is really good. They're the Prydain Chronicles, the first one's the Book of Three, is really good for kids to just grow in an adventure story. They're really good kids books, I think. Good for adults too, I love them. But there's a really good sense of, that I haven't found in any other book, of what it means to just explore both the physical world and finding cool new stuff, but also explore as you're growing, maturing into the person that you're supposed to be. So I think this book does those really well. It doesn't have any weird, what you have to be very careful with in any fiction, doesn't have any weird sexual stuff. It doesn't have any weird, it's not trying to push any agenda on you, and it's, they're really good books. The one downside of the Prydain is, and I think it illustrates a problem that a lot of fantasy novels have, is the kind of final battle is not done very well. And I think most authors struggle with this. Even the problem is every story needs it, but you can't imagine what the actual final battle of the world would look like. It's very hard. Just read Revelation. That's as close as we're going to get to a good one. Even Tolkien, his whole story he needed for his whole mythology to work, he knew he needed a last battle, kind of equivalent to, Armageddon or Ragnarok or any of those. But he never wrote it. He had parts and ideas, and we can look at those, but he never wrote it because it's really hard to write. So I do think that's the downside of the Prydain Chronicles, but I definitely think the Prydain Chronicles are up there for good novels that Christians should be familiar with. So if we're looking at stuff that inspired the Christian authors that we love, we should look at, and a lot of Christians miss this author's writings, we should look at the fantasy novels of George MacDonald. If you haven't heard of him before, first of all, you're welcome. Go look at him, but go look up his stuff. But he was the guy that C.S. Lewis kind of credits for beginning his conversion, and he did it just through C.S. Lewis read this fantasy novel, actually called Fantasies, but with a PH at the beginning instead of an F. He read George MacDonald's Fantasies, and C.S. Lewis says, that's what baptized my imagination. So I have a copy here. I apologize. I didn't know any better when I got this. I was much younger. It's a print-on-demand book. I don't think you should usually get these on Amazon, these print-on-demand books. I don't have a good copy of George MacDonald's novels, but Christians, I think, should be familiar with his work. He inspired most of the Christian fantasy authors we know. Let's look at just a couple of his books, because he wrote a lot. So the first one is Fantasies. It's the one that kind of pushed C.S. Lewis towards God, and I really like it. It's very symbolic. It's like a huge parable, kind of. This guy's traveling in fairyland. It's super symbolic. It has that journeying motif that I like, where you're discovering stuff, but it's more showing how this guy's growing as a parable for the Christian life. And one of the cool things about his journey is literally anything might happen. So some books say that, or some movies, literally, I can't go into all the weird twists and turns that happen, but it's very magical in the sense of it's this magical journey and anything might happen. One of the problems with this book is it's super hyper symbolic, and if you're not looking for kind of poetry in prose form, you might not like it. Another one that I really like of his that I think anybody could get into, and I'll put links for finding these books, and you can even find free PDF versions of most of these books, is The Light Princess. It's super good. It's in the fairy tale style, like Grimm's fairy tales and stuff. It's super good, and it's a big parable on humility. Okay, the last one for George MacDonald that I want to mention is his book Lilith, and Tolkien was like, yeah, this kind of it was not good. It was just not a good story, and I'd have to agree. But it's kind of ruined by George MacDonald was a universalist, which means he thought everybody was going to be saved, even, and this is crazy, but even the devil in the end is going to be saved and convert. That's nonsense, and it ruins his novel because your philosophy and your viewpoint informs what you write and everything that you do. But it's a puzzle that I still enjoy reading it. I'm not recommending any Christians unless you just want to know more. But it's a puzzle it's very symbolic, written like all this stuff. But it's just something to gnaw on and think about, even the parts that are difficult. Okay, so we've looked at the two really, really great Christian authors, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. We've looked at some of the people that inspired them, like the Mabing Yong, and a book that can kind of introduce you to that Welsh mythology. We've looked at George MacDonald. Let's look at some of the people who were inspired by them. So the next person I'm going to be talking about is his pen name. He was wildly popular before he passed away, somewhat recently, not super recently, but he's more modern than these other authors we've been talking about. His pen name's Robert Jordan. His real name was James Oliver Rigney Jr. And his Wheel of Time series that's it's recently been made into, it seems Amazon just wants to make everything. They've realized that this is this really fertile field and Christians haven't, so Amazon just wants to make them all into movies and stuff. So there's been a Wheel of Time series that Amazon is making. I'm not going to go into that, but his Wheel of Time series is a really important fantasy series, I would say, and we're going to discuss it a little bit. I'll show you the first novel. It's pretty good, pretty hefty sized book. There's 14 of those in the series, so it's too much for most normal people to read the whole thing. And so some of my thoughts on this is I would say he's the greatest, in some sense, he's the greatest American author. A lot of these people I was talking about were not Americans, like C.S. Lewis, Tolkien. I would say maybe I want someone to prove me wrong on this and show me a better American author, but so far I haven't, and I've read a lot of fantasy and a lot of novels. Yeah, Mark Twain, a lot of people say, and I love Mark Twain, and he's awesome. And he might actually be better overall, because if you look overall at Robert Jordan's corpus, he's going to have some really problematic books that his overall rating might go down. But this series, I would say, is the best stuff to come out of America as far as novels and fiction is concerned. So what are some of the good parts of it that I really like? It has a really engrossing narrative, extensive world building. So Tolkien talked about how important it is as image of God that we build. We're sub-creators. We build worlds in our imagination and in writing and all these kind of things. Well, he does that really, really well. And the characters, the personalities he creates are just really good. Well, except for the bad guys are kind of two-dimensional. But the main characters are very engrossing. And one thing that I think in this series that is really, really helpful for a Christian, especially, looking at a Christian light, and Robert Jordan was Episcopalian, so he was Christian, although he was kind of Episcopalian Unitarian, but he wasn't Unitarian, he was completely Episcopalian, but a lot of his beliefs were more, in a way, Unitarian if you look into it. But so I think the Wheel of Time really helps us as Christians to just imagine what a time-spanning evil, personal evil, like a person who's completely evil, like the devil. It's not the devil in the book, but I guess if you were trying to fit it into a Christian worldview, you'd say, well, it's a devil, not the devil. But how this just eternal evil could enact plans and just have his hand on all of history. Tolkien does that a little bit, but I think the Wheel of Time just shows better than anything else I've read, helps you to understand how so on a personal level, C.S. Lewis is the screw tape levels, but on a macro level, how the devil kind of works and influences history. Another really good part of this series is it explores mental health issues. I know that sounds weird to say it in that kind of dry technical way, but mental health issues in a really organic and good way to help us understand them. Also, this series has really awesome plot twists that aren't just like haha moments, but they really make you stop and think. So all those are really good. I can't put this as the greatest novel, though, of all time for many reasons, even though I want to because I really enjoy it, because there are definitely a lot of problematic themes in it. And this, I can't give it just a resounding recommendation because of some of these. The author's poor deistic philosophy kind of undercuts a lot of it, especially his thought, and I'm not going to go through, maybe I'll do a series reviewing each book, but his idea that good kind of needs evil to be good, which isn't true, obviously. The Trinity is totally good, and they're good just in relation to each other, and they don't need any evil for us to see it better. But that's a whole different discussion, but it does bring down the series a little bit. And then there's just, there's not a lot of bad sexual scenes like in most fantasy novels and stuff. There are a couple, which that's a bad part. But even more troubling is just this acceptance of not good relationships. A lot of the characters start out from seemingly very similar to a Christian background, and a lot of them end up having multiple wives and stuff. So that's difficult. That doesn't mean you can't read it. You can read the Bible even though David had multiple wives, even though it wasn't good for David to have multiple wives. But those are some, I think especially the polyamory is problematic in this novel. Overall, I still recommend it, but it's definitely, even though it's really well written, all this stuff, that brings it down. So other books that I would look at as finding, okay, these are really good books for Christians to read, fantasy novels and science fiction especially, would be, so I like ones that are just fun. Just a fun novel. The Hobbit, that's one of the things I like about it. It's really just fun. You may have noticed that, like The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis, Horse and His Boy, C.S. Lewis, those are all just really fun books. Well, if you're looking for more of a Hobbit-esque, just fun book, like these other ones I was looking at are really deep, dark in some ways, especially The Children of Hurin is the darkest book probably I've ever read in some ways. But if you're looking for just more fun ones, a novel that I think is overlooked that is really, really amazingly good, especially for children, is The Gamage Cup by Carol Kindle. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. It's really good, and I think we overlook it. It's definite. It has a very Hobbit-esque storyline, very fun. It shows adventure very well, and it's a different kind of living off the land than, say, The Hobbit or these other adventure stories. It's like a fantasy version of Little House on the Prairie, which I also love Little House on the Prairie, but a fantasy kind of version of that. And I really like that. I think it's very good for kids to see how would we do stuff if we just had to suddenly, we're in the wilderness, we want to build a house, we want to stay alive. How do we do that? And I think that's really awesome for all of us to imaginatively do and actually look at, but especially for kids. And one thing I really like about it is a lot of these novels have, we're looking at gray areas, this guy's evil, but there's these reasons he's being evil, and trying to help you understand that. The thing I like about The Gamage Cup, the evil, it's almost two-dimensional, but I wouldn't say two-dimensional. It just presents the bad guys as their whole purpose is to be bad guys that we're supposed to fight. There's these monsters that we're supposed to fight. We don't need to get into it more than that. And I think that's healthy. So we've gone over quite a few novels that I think are very good for Christians to read and consider and just build the Christian reader up. But for different reasons, I wouldn't say any of them are the best novel. So I have to bring in some weird random one that most people haven't heard of for the best, in my opinion. And this isn't objectively the best. This is one of those videos where I'm saying objectively, for sure, this is the best. This is more from reading all this, from my background as reading these, and that I would think is the best. Is this book by an author? He converted from Lutheranism to Catholicism. And his story is really interesting in and of itself. But he's German, and this book is originally in German. But Hans Bemmen's The Stone and the Flute, and this is the translation I really like too, because he wrote it in German. He didn't write it in English. But it is just, it combines all these elements that I've said are good in these other novels and puts them together. First of all, it's just a massive read. So that's one bad part. That if you're not going to dedicate a lot of time, you're not going to read it. It's kind of like these aren't fantasy novels, but when Christians a lot of times will recommend reading The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. I'm mispronouncing that, and you're like, oh yes, all these Christians that I love recommend that. I'm going to go read it, and you're all happy. You look at it, and it's this huge, thick book. Well, this is even thicker than The Brother, and takes more time commitment than The Brothers Karamazov, if that's possible. One of the things, so just a quick description of it is, it kind of tells the whole life story of a person. Hard to imagine, but everything about his life is in there. Not in a boring way, but in a realistic way, because it's not boring when we're living our life. But it would be if you just narrated every single thing we do. But it's the only book I've ever encountered that realistically, this is the whole of everything that happens to one person's life. The closest next would be The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, but it just shows a little slice holistically of a person's life. This shows the whole thing. And it's very clearly, the life of a son of Adam. It's very much a parable for Adam's children. We're messed up by sin. We want good things, but we don't look for them in a good way. So it has one of the things I think is important from Tolkien's work is he says all his stories are the story, and all history, Tolkien says, is a story of the long defeat. Adam lost, our race lost in Adam to evil, and all of history is just that story of that long defeat. Well, this shows that very well. Even though it's a great adventure story like I love, it has lots of discovering this whole big world. Yeah, it has all that, which is awesome. But it just shows just how futile it is to be a human person, how futile it seems. All these, we're always seeking for these things that we think are going to be good, but first of all, a lot of times we can't get them, and even when we can get them, we're like, yes, I got that thing that I really wanted, but it's just very, very futile. And this book, The Stone and the Flute, shows that, and very well. And everybody can see in the character, oh, that's me, that's humanity, and I think that's really amazing. One thing that it shows how human things, like if only I had the best wife, then I could be good and do good and my life would be fulfilled, or if only I was super rich, or if only this or only that. All those are good things. They're very good things, but nothing human can fulfill us, right? St. Augustine famously says, any Catholic that's watching this has heard this 100 times, but it's very true that our hearts are restless until they rest in you, Lord. And so it doesn't matter however many good human goods we try to stuff in our hearts, it's not going to fill up the God-sized hole in there, right? And this book shows that super well, because the things that the main character is seeking, a lot of times he's not getting them, but even when after all hardships and stuff, he gets these super awesome good treasures that are good, and gets the girl and gets the princess and all that, then what? It doesn't fulfill you. And this book shows that really well. It shows also many compelling redemption stories, which I think is a very important part of any novel, right? Tolkien said the cornerstone of fantasy is that eucatastrophe, that happy turnaround that shows that kind of is a type for the resurrection. It shows that really well. Even for those people that it seems totally beyond redemption, the author compellingly shows how this person who's just deep down evil can be redeemed, even that person. And I think that's important because God can redeem anybody. Another aspect of this book is it's basically an extended parable on when you're trying to force people to do what you want, even if it's good things. What happens, because we can never do evil that good may come of it. And a theme of this book is when we try to force people either through brute force or tricking them, or all these different ways we can try to force people to do what we want, even if it's good things, and we want these good things for people. It's never going to work out the way that we want it to. It's never going to actually produce good. And just the whole problem of free will and force and how that interacts with God. He wants us to be in heaven with him. He knows we're his good, but he can't force us. This novel will help you understand that very, very much. Another thing that I really like in this novel is it shows the devil really well. The devil in this book is he's the gray one. He's everything of life and happiness is washed out of him, and he makes everything great. That's what sin does. And it's just a really good parable. I'm not going to go more into it, but that image of the devil is not like this really exciting person, because he's not. He's a really boring, pathetic creature in reality, but still tempting, still able to tempt us, still really smart. This book shows that aspect of sin deadens everything. It makes the world gray, and who has the worst sin is the devil. He's utterly gray, and he's so washed out of life that he puts that onto you, and the different temptations. So the devil is a very realistic character in this book. There's a lot of good elements there, and I would say this: The Stone and the Flute, Hans Beeman, Stone and the Flute is probably the best the best fantasy novel for Christians, or overall even, that I've come across. And I encourage everyone, if they want to spend a big portion of their life reading a book, to read that. If not, read The Hobbit, read Narnia. That won't take a big part of your life. Last thought that I wanted to leave people with is, so we can't keep losing the culture wars in the realm of fantasy and fiction as Christians. And I'm calling everybody, we can't just leave it to the irreligious, this filled. So we need to, first of all, if you have the talent, make great fiction. We need good Christian fiction. And even if not, we need to promote great fiction, because it builds us up in a way other stuff doesn't. And we want the Christian fiction, the good fiction, as opposed to the fiction that's going to lead people to evil, death, and despair. Thank you for watching. Have a blessed day. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Please hit the like button and drop a comment down below. If you really liked it, consider subscribing and hitting the bell notification so you never miss a video. If you want to help me produce more great videos just like this, please support me on Locals. There's a link in the description. And that you'll get all sorts of good benefits for being a part of our Locals community, and you'll help me produce these great videos. Thank you so much.